Good morning. I'm going to tell you about intelligent autonomous surgical robot that can operate like human surgeons. The STAR, Smart Tissue Autonomous Robot, will usher in a new field of surgery for the future. If humans are to be multiplanetary species in 13 years, that's in 2030, you will need an intelligent autonomous surgical robot for two simple reasons. Number one, you cannot be sending your best surgeons every time you have a mission to another planet. That's number one. And I'll explain why that's not mathematically possible. The second reason is that it's too far, somewhere between 50 million to 400 million kilometers away. It's just too. There really isn't a bandwidth, telecommunication bandwidth, to provide a real-time support for any surgical emergencies. Terrestrial reason for why you would need an autonomous robotic surgeon is equally compelling and perhaps even more overwhelming. Because just imagine a future if you or your loved one or your child needs a surgery. Wouldn't it be best that you can have an access to best surgeon any place, anytime, anywhere in the world? And the only way to do that is to be able to program best surgeons' judgments and techniques into a machine, have it available. So the motivation, terrestrial motivation, is essentially to democratize surgery to improve outcomes and reduce complications. Having said that, the current state of surgery is still very transactional. It's person to person. It's only as good as surgeon who operates on you. It depends on surgeon's skill sets, experience, training, clinical volumes, and how you get referred, and all these things. And this is no different than about 150 years ago, where essentially it was a theater and essentially an art of surgery that's completely variable depending on surgeon skill sets. Introduction of technology, whether it be it's minimally invasive or robotic technology, really haven't changed that sort of paradigm. If anything at all, it increased the disparity in terms of access to the best technology that's available and techniques that's available. And then part of the reason maybe is because some of these technologies may be outstripping human capacity and capability. Each one of these, yesterday we had a pleasure and privilege of meeting Buzz Aldrin here. Each one of these technologies probably has more computing bandwidth than the rocket that sort of sent man to the moon. With this kind of technology, it's really outstripping human capacity and capability. What we need is a seamless coordination and an intelligence that can expand human surgeons' capacity and capability. There are four reasons why you would want to have, other than putting myself out of job, four reasons why you would want to consider having an intelligent autonomous robot to operate. Number one, each year there are about 230 million or so major surgical procedures performed around the world. This is considered about a third of burden of illness for Earth. This is about 140 million procedures short of what is really needed. To train a surgeon takes about 15 to 20 years. Once they reach a certain level of competence, their shelf life is about another 15 to 20 years. You can never produce enough surgeons, not only for the earthly reasons, but send enough over them to extraplanetary opportunities. Second thing is that when you actually specifically look at the procedure-related complication, take an anastomosis as an example. This really hasn't changed despite introduction of all the technologies, including staplers and robots and minimally invasive techniques and so on. It still runs somewhere between 1 to, depending on applications, it can be as high as 48%, for instance, in pediatric surgery. Anytime you have a complication, your risk of dying goes up by 3 to 10 times. And the impact to the healthcare is about 40% more. Wouldn't it be nice that anytime you have a procedure, an anastomosis done, it does a perfect anastomosis so that you do not have any complications and your outcomes are guaranteed? And I think part of the solution comes in having an intelligent, autonomous robotic technology. When bad things happen in surgery, a significant part has to do with human factors, and then it's been demonstrated in insurance data and as well as a sort of population-based data that it has to do with the judgment issues and situational awareness by the surgeon at the time of surgery. Human factor issues clearly demonstrated by Berkeley studies back in 2013, where he videotaped a number of what you consider competent surgeons doing bariatric surgery, and then calculated complications. What it shows is that the more your peer thought, looking at your videotapes of doing a procedure, the more they thought you were competent, less likely that you will have complications. So, but wouldn't it be nice that everybody is just as good as anybody else? Surgeons look for competence when you get qualified, but what you're looking for is that gap between competence and proficiency. And then being able to program best techniques and technology into a machine is essentially closing that gap and democratizing it. And then the final reason why you want to sort of coming up with an intelligent autonomous robot is precisely this. This is a penetration rate of a current robotic technology. It's only about 15%. And then this is a minimal invasive degree of penetration, about 70 to 80% penetration for simpler procedures. And then most of anything other than simple procedures, the diffusion rate remains somewhere in very low double digits. Cell phones have been around for 10 years, internet maybe about 20 some odd years. If you got a technology that's been around for 30, 40 years, and then if only 15% of people are using it, there's something fundamentally wrong with the technology. And part of the reason, I think, is because the way in which technology is designed isn't quite appropriate for human sort of ergonomics and so on. And some of the technologies are essentially outstripping how we can use it effectively. So what is our solution? It's essentially a paradigm shift. It's a disruption. We are looking for an intelligent, autonomous technology that works not simply as an extension of human capacity and capability, but not just master-slave, but master-master. In other words, whenever a surgeon is operating, the tool itself has a programmed intelligence that has best surgeons' techniques and judgments into it, to have it available. Initially as a supervised collaborative, but ultimately you can imagine that it can replace potentially some parts of surgery. Is that possible? So this is Surgery 101 for those of you. We only do 4 things. Number one, we spend a bit of time getting into the problem. We spend quite a bit of time getting rid of the problem, like as an appendectomy. And then we put it together this is a reconstruction portion of it, and then we close at the end. The reason why this hasn't been done by a sort of a robot, intelligent robot, is because this represents, and then this is for the NASA folks, unstructured, deformable target and mobile target in an unstructured environment. And robot doesn't know where things are other than surgeon manipulating it. So idea is that if you can do one of the more complex part of surgery autonomously and intelligently, you can imagine that you can program the entire surgical procedure and then into a machine and have it potentially available.
STAR ushers in the future of surgery to expand a surgeon's capability and capacity.
What you're seeing is a surgical tool that is supervised and then autonomously placing specific sutures. And you will see that it's in the same working space as a surgeon. It's a collaborative paradigm. Just imagine that something like that is done, anytime that is done, it's done perfectly.
From the best surgeons in the world.
So what would enable us to do that kind of an autonomous surgical procedure? We improved, as a surgeon, I use only 3 things: my eyes, my hands, and my mind. We improved the vision by adding what we call quantitative imaging and near-infrared, so that it allows the machine to be aware where things are in XYZ 3-dimensional space. And it's able to follow the target tissue of interest in real time in a sub-millimeter accuracy. We added a sensing technology so that the machine feels and touches, and then we programmed the best surgeon's technique of how to do that in an anastomosis. So when we compare this in a real clinical setting, so this is a preclinical setting of a pig intestine, and this is a standard way in which one would consider a longitudinal cut along the intestine, or putting 2 ends together like this, and then we compare in this preclinical setup with experienced surgeons using open surgical tools, minimally invasive, and current robotic technology, and compare that to the STAR. And then these are some of the parameters. It's a little dense. Line spacing, when you compare STAR to all the other techniques, It is tighter. It tolerates pressure about 4 times better. It makes less mistakes. Time is comparable to laparoscopic technique. And then it causes a less reduction, narrowing, artificial narrowing of the intestine. It does 60% of this procedure in fully autonomous way, 40% in supervised, meaning that machine would choose where it wants to place the suture, and surgeon would simply approve it. And we've done that since that time, number of fully autonomous anastomosis. So this is a sort of summary of the sort of a value proposition for it. It really enables you to do a sort of sensitive and difficult reconstructive portion of it. It will potentially reduce complications. It democratizes surgery by having potential best techniques and technology available for anybody and anywhere. And then it will naturally increase the adoption of this particular technology. This is your combination of market, competition, and new team slide. So everybody talks about $1 billion market. There's only single player in the current surgical robotic market, Intuitive. Their market cap is $34 billion. This market is expected to grow over the next 3-4 years to $20 billion from about $600 million this year. There are 2 additional players coming into the market over the next 2 years. Verb, combination of Google and Johnson & Johnson, and then Medtronic, who used to be Covidien. Their paradigm is to penetrate the market in as master slave, cheaper instruments, lowering the cost. It's very different than our business model. Where we are in terms of business development, we just went through a seed round from Great Point Venture, San Francisco Bay Area investment firm. They believe in the vision of democratizing surgery, which I thought was a very refreshing for a Bay Area firm. And we can talk in more details about the sort of business aspect of it at a round table. So why am I here other than trying to put myself out of business? I think that NASA needs to build a surgical pod for surgical emergencies, which includes autonomous surgical robot. And I submit one particular case of appendectomy as a sort of proof of concept principle. Some of you may have had appendectomies already. It's a little organ that's located between large and small intestine, gets inflamed. The only effective treatment is surgery. It occurs in 1 out of 7. So at some point, if it's not a weekend space trip, when you have to go months, years at a time, somebody will get this. And then DARPA, when it analyzed the risk assessment, they suggest that all astronauts should have their appendix and gallbladders taken out, especially in view of the fact that you have now laparoscopic tools available. But those are real risks, and people die from these interval appendectomies and elective gallbladder surgery. We have additional vision technologies, such as hyperspectral and soft robotic tools that can distinguish between inflamed and normal tissue, that allows procedures to be done very much like human fingers. So I think this is a very doable. We can do that in about 15 months with a partnership. And I think this is a mission critical. If you're going to go to Mars in about 13 years, that's a pretty short time. The older I get, the rate at which time changes seems to be shorter and shorter. And this is time latency curve. You know, it's hundreds of years of NASA's sort of a celebration this year. And then it was 120 years ago, there was a first flight. And now we're planning to go to Mars. You will never have enough telecommunication capacity and time to be able to provide a real-time support for surgical emergencies. So with that, I'd really like to thank the NASA for the privilege of the podium. I mean, we jokingly say this is not a brain surgery or rocket science, but yesterday we were in the sort of company of rocket scientists pitching for the sort of same type of a thing. And then I'd like to thank Kara, Tom, Tim, Jose, and Daniel for the support. It's been just a tremendous experience. Thank you so much. Peter, please. Only my little patients call me doctor.
All right.
I'm a pediatric surgeon by training.
In addition to creating more opportunities to give surgeries, this seems like it could also have an impact on the training of new surgeons, residency requirements, et cetera, too, because you would have some best practices that people could strive to try to match. And I don't know if you had thought of that as a
Yes,
part of the autonomy.
Absolutely. So I think that's absolutely necessary. I think in the future, that many of the procedures that we actually learn by apprenticeship type of model in clinical setting, I think you'll have to do it through simulation. But where I want to go with this is that with the connectivity, and people talked about sort of deep learning and neural network and so on, at your fingertip, anytime you are to operate on a particular setting with a sensor technology, you have best minds information, not only at current horizontally, but throughout the history, so that you can provide really the best decision and so on. Simulation, absolutely, with this kind of a sort of actuated and intelligent technology, it's coming. So that will be an absolute necessity for very much like NASA pilots training for missions and so on. I think surgeons will be updating their skills, and then I think some of the qualifications and certifications will be based on how much simulation time you've had in the future.
As a follow-on, would you envision that in the future there'd be more general practitioners because you can always get help on any specialized type of surgery, or would you still have a lot of specialization?
Yes and no, in a sense that there will be some specialties, some specializations, but you will now have a sort of an access to not only the best competence, but best proficiency. So in that way, it sort of flattens it. There are some subspecialties in medicine that will go away, like a pattern recognition specialties like a radiology, dermatology, and pathology, for instance. So it will be a very different kind of a disciplines in medicine in the future, I believe.
Hi. One of the things I'm interested in is the cultural pushback on something like surgical, robotic surgery, getting the public to accept it. Do you see that as a major issue? I mean, like, would I get on an airplane with no pilots? And I know NASA's working on that, and I'm thinking, I'm not sure I would. Do you see an issue with that?
I would put it the other way. So currently, Institute of Medicine published a paper back in 2001 that each year, because of medical error and complications, that about 100,000 people die in this country alone. There is a perception that this rate has decreased. So the 100,000 people, meaning that 1747 falling out of sky every day. There is a perception that that rate has decreased due to quality improvement, assurance, and all those things. Re-estimation by Hopkins recently in public health, actually that number is about somewhere between 250,000 to 400,000. That's the third most common cause of death in this country other than cancer and heart. So I put it the other way, as a surgeon, as a competent surgeon, preferably proficient surgeon, if there is a technology that will enable me to be better surgeon in my capacity and capability, why wouldn't I? Having said that, when we do the need analysis among surgeons, there are those who are somewhat defensive about it, but increasingly more and more are welcoming. This generated quite a bit of, when we published the paper in Science last year, generated quite a bit of, initially, fear among patients that we created some sort of a sentient being that will operate independently. Or surgeons feel that they are always proud so they can provide a better sort of technical support. But I think it's increasingly clear that more and more people are accepting that this is a way in which the future the future care will be given. And we already use it in terms of sort of data-based, evidence-based, competence-based sort of a type of a paradigm.
So let me ask a little bit on the hardware side of this discussion. Obviously, you're focusing on a narrow number of things, but over time, you care about the breadth of options, particularly for a space mission. We would like to have a surgical tool that could handle a wide variety of surgeries if necessary. How much does the hardware have to change, or does the hardware you showed us that's actually inserted into the body, is that capable of handling most surgeries, surgical techniques, or do you have to have a variety of end effectors found?
Tom, answer that question for me, because the three options I mentioned about, if you go to Mars, you can't come back because it takes forever. You can't call because it takes forever. The idea is that the reason I chose appendectomy is because it's common enough. If you program that, you can continue, you'll have a basic set of tool sets for same tools, dexterity, for certain number that we think NASA thinks is priority. But the other ones, you can continually program and send it off because the basic tool sets and designs of it really haven't changed in millennia, if you will, from Roman time. When you look at surgical instruments, from Roman times to medieval to open to laparoscopic to current surgical robots, they're all the same. Same mechanics, same ergonomics, if you will. So it won't change. We are adding more, such as soft robotics that functions more like a human fingers, for instance. So I think it's a very scalable solution. And I thank Tom for that.
So I'm curious, if you said it, I missed it, but how do you acquire the procedural knowledge, the medical procedural knowledge? How do you validate it? And do you have any type of machine learning to constantly improve based on every surgery or other techniques?
Fantastic question. The reason why we chose anastomosis as a proof of concept is because surgeons are obsessed with anastomosis. There's a huge amount of literature that's been written about it. There's a staplers that come out of it. The reason why I mentioned a little bit about hyperspectral is because how we do procedures, 90% of what we do isn't validated by any so it's not like a parachute double-blinded study kind of a thing. It works, so therefore it must, so we can't change that type of a thing. What we are doing here is a paradigm shift in a sense that adding a vision that's beyond human visual spectrum, so that it gives you not just the physical information, but a physiologic information, so that decisions are made by, whether it be machine learning, and we are applying some of the machine learning the algorithms into it, and this will be part of the program that will go into it. Ultimately, so whenever decisions made, whether it be technical or judgment, it's the optimal one for the purpose of the better functional outcome. When they tested the Alphago by Google, I was quite intrigued by the fact that when you have these machine learnings, they make a slightly different decision than human beings for the purpose of ultimate outcome, what the outcome is. They're not looking for a big win, but they want to have a sort of a assured, better outcome, if you will. So I think combining human sort of decision, what's been published about multitude of surgical procedures, and then combining that with the machine learning, I think ultimately you'll get to sort of a best solution for all these procedures.
So you touched on it a second ago, the sensor capability, and if you could elaborate on the capability that the robot actually has to differentiate between different sizes of the tissues and things like that before the human eye could actually see it or differentiate.
So in the first generation, when you have a current surgical robot, it's simply is a power tool at your fingertips, if you will. So it moves exactly like, and it has no awareness of it. By adding what we call quantitative imaging, it knows where things are in three-dimensional space, not only for the tooltips, but the target tissue of interest as well. In addition to that, we added infrared as initially some fiducials to recognize of the particular target tissue of interest. And again, these are sort of part of the programming. But as we add more, such as hyperspectral, and my colleague Richard Chai is here, but he's a sort of hyperspectral expert, you can not only get tissue information about how thick it is, what the density is, whether there's a subsurface blood vessels, what the perfusion rate is. So essentially, you're sort of making providing initially an intelligent information for whoever is initially making a decision. But ultimately, I think combination of human and machine, and then perhaps it may just be machine ultimately. Yes, thank you.
Just wanted to verify, your first product is the sutures? Is that what you're?
We chose anastomosis as a sort of first series of products, but the real core innovation is in the vision part, as in the intelligence part. Because what that allows you to do is, whether you staple or suture or whatever it is, allows you to do in a best place how to do it. There are 3 or 4 specific milestones that we want to hit, because there are over 1.5 million of these anastomoses that are done each year in this country for gastrointestinal, urologic, and gynecological procedures. And so I think that is a sort of time-saving element, and at the same time, sort of complication element, and then also when you add adoption, increase element, I think it makes a very significant business case.
Okay, and you said that you have 3-dimensional, you can tell where it is, but when you put the elastomer or the staple, I assume you need 6-degree motion, or is that correct?
So the robot arm itself has 4 degrees of freedom, and it has a sort of because it will be a laparoscopic, it has a constraint around the sort of entry point to it, but you don't really need all 7 degrees of it. And then we will, there's about 3 or 4 additional degrees, so you should be able to do all the things that your hands can do.
Who's next? Questions? We do have one.
I think going back to this gentleman's question just a minute or two ago, you mentioned Alphago and sort of the collection that you would need. So Alphago simulates Go matches on like a huge order of magnitude, which is how it's able to beat humans at playing the game. Like if it had only played the same number of matches as a human, then it would not probably be able to beat a human, right? So they've sort of proven that it's data poor, right? It needs like tons of data to actually be good at it. So with what you're doing, would you have your computer vision watch surgeons perform the surgery to collect the data? Or would you have it performing surgeries in a 3D simulation? Or would you have it perform surgeries with dummies and dolls? Like how is the actual data collection? How does that come through?
It is already done, as in, so all the other companies are trying to buy off what we do. Johnson & Johnson, whenever they have, very much like a black box as an example, intuitive, there is a black box of memory of all the procedures that are done already. So there is already a library data bank of this. And in addition to that, some of these companies actually filling in data. And from our perspective, your point is well taken that what is the minimal data set that's required to provide an intelligent algorithm to come up with as good or better? And then, we're sort of working on that aspect to it because you're right that more the merrier in terms of deep learning and data analysis.
So right now, then, it is using computer vision to watch the surgery? Is that how it's extracting the data?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. This is a very basic question. French scientists who develop a lot of technology, they have a very nice saying that goes, technology is very useful when it works. So what happens if for any reason the technology is not working? What is the B plan?
So it's no different than any other. So the default position obviously is for the time being humans, but at the same, and then this goes a little deeper than simply technology not working, but having, because it goes to the regulatory approval for autonomous sort of tissue targets. And there are robots already for hard tissue and orthopedics that are approved. So you have to have a sort of backup systems that are up and running. At least 2 or 3 of them, I think, for some of these, and to get an FDA approval. And there are already predicate devices. So in terms of regulatory process, we can talk about it at sort of a small round table, but I think it's a very feasible solution. Yeah. Thank you.